Okay.
There are two people in history who astounded the contemporaries so much that they asked the question not who is he, but what is he? Those two people were Jesus and Buddha, and they gave answers that were completely different. First, Buddha said that he was not God. Unequivocally, he said he was not God, that he was just a mere man. And Jesus claimed to be God. Now, the divinity of Christ, that's the distinctive claim of Christianity, and it's what separates Christianity from other religions. In order to be a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is God, because that's what Christ said. Buddhists believe what Buddha said, Confucians believe what Confucius said, and Muslims believe what Muhammad said. So in order to really be a Christian, you have to believe what Christ said. And this divinity of Christ doctrine has to be it's the skeleton key to the rest of the doctrines. Because if you believe that Jesus is God, then you'll accept what he says as absolute authority. Whereas if Jesus was just a mere human, you could write off any certain things that he says because humans can make mistakes. You could undermine his unpopular teachings. However, if he is God, then you have an absolute obligation to obey his teachings. So this claim is so shocking. You have a man who is born of a woman, and he claims to be God. This is a guy who gets dirt under his fingernails. He was just a carpenter, but all of a sudden he's claiming to be God. So it's if you think about other Christians, sometimes you'll realize that it is a shock for them. So Jesus claims to be divine, and one way he does, he says, "I and the Father are one." This quotation sometimes people take to mean, oh, he just has a really strong union with God. He's like a Hindu in some way. But we can't really take it to be a Hindu because of the context. The listeners, nobody listening to him takes him to be speaking as if he's a Hindu. They say, "This man is blaspheming," and they proceed to stone him. And Jesus doesn't try to correct him. That's a very important point. Then also, Jesus claims to forgive sins. He says, "Your sins are forgiven." And people around him say, "He is blaspheming. Who but God alone can forgive sins? Of course, I can forgive your sins for the sins you do against me, but I can't forgive sins for what you do against somebody else." So Jesus is claiming to forgive the sins of the latter part of that. And also after the resurrection, there's that part where Jesus appears to the disciples and Thomas isn't there. And then the disciples tell Thomas and say, "Jesus appeared to us." And he says, "No, I don't believe you. Unless I put my fingers in the nail marks in his hands and my hand in his side, I will believe." Jesus appears to Thomas the next week, and Thomas does that. And then once Thomas puts his hands in the nail marks, or his fingers in the nail marks in Jesus' hands and his hand in Jesus' side, he exclaims, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus doesn't say, no, "You've gone too far, Thomas. I'm not God." He says, Have you come to believe because you have seen? And that is very affirmative. He's affirming Thomas that, yes, I am God. And amongst that, there's a lot of other claims of divinity that Jesus has throughout the Gospels. And they list it in the reading at the end of the chapter. So let's move on to the very common apologetics argument. It's the liar, lunatic, Lord argument. And it starts off because Jesus claims to be God. That he's either right about that or he is wrong. And one thing to note is most people see that Jesus is trustworthy. All the great religions of the world, most of them will claim that Jesus is just some great religious teacher or some prophet. But to be honest with you, that answer is an unacceptable answer. And we'll explain why that is. It's because a trustworthy person, their teaching is trustworthy. And especially their teaching about their own identity. So if we don't trust their identity, we can't call them trustworthy. And that's one of the oldest arguments in apologetics is the aut deus aut homo malus argument, which means either God or a bad man. So if Jesus is right about his claim to divinity, if he is right about being God, he is the Lord. But if he is wrong, he either knew it or he didn't know it. And if he knew it, he would be a liar. If he didn't know it, he would be a lunatic. So let's investigate those alternatives. Let's see what that means. So somebody who claims to be God and is not God is not a good man. If you go to church on Sunday and the preacher stands up there and says, "All right, everybody, I am actually the God who created you. I want you to bow down and worship me. I will be the one who saves your souls." You wouldn't think he was a good man now, would you? You'd probably get up, go find the nearest exit. Also, why is Jesus not a liar? So what's the difference? Why is Jesus not a liar? Liars get something out of it. They get money, fame, power, pleasure. Jesus got crucified. He knew it. He welcomed it. He allowed it. He had no motive for a lie, if it was a lie. He was hated, he was rejected, he was persecuted, and he was tortured. So could he be a lunatic? There's a lot of people who are in insane asylums claiming to be Elvis, claiming to be God, claiming to be Napoleon. But why is Jesus any different? Well, he doesn't fit the profile of a lunatic. Most lunatics, the characteristics of them are egotism, narcissism, inflexibility, dullness. Jesus was none of those. Jesus was very wise, very kind, very loving. He was always interesting. And a lot of times if we were to meet a lunatic, we would feel uncomfortable because we would feel superior to him. Jesus' enemies, on the other hand, were uncomfortable because of the opposite reason. They felt inferior to him. Let's see. Oh yeah, and there's been a couple of arguments that have been developed in the 20th century. The myth and the guru alternatives to trying to get out of that liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. The first one is myth. The idea here is Jesus never made the claim, and this is probably the most common argument that most skeptics have these days. And the first thing that we respond to is the length of time between the events and the writings is relatively short. So as we showed last time, we showed the timeline of when the Gospels were written, and they were all written within living memory of many of the people who were living at the time of Jesus. And so a claim as crazy as the divinity of Christ, if that would have just popped up randomly 30 years later, that could have been disputed by the people who had known Jesus. They would have said, no, that's not true. He didn't claim divinity at all. Another response to that is there's 4 writers of the Gospels. There's 4 writers of Jesus' ministry, and then of course the letters from Paul as well. And you can use those to triangulate that there was never a point in time where there was a non-supernatural Jesus. Jesus always claimed divinity. There was never a time where he was just a human and then people introduced a supernatural layer on top of that. And then another question we have to bring up is, why would anybody invent the myth? Christians were persecuted until the 4th century, early in the 4th century. So why would somebody create a joke to be persecuted, to be tortured, to be thrown to the lions? The other alternative is guru. So this one is, like Jesus, we must all discover our own divinity. Thousands of people, they claim to be God too, and they're not liars or lunatics. They're gurus, they're yogis, they're spiritual masters, they're enlightened mystics. The problem with these claims is Jesus isn't a Hindu, he's a Jew. So there's a big difference between the Hindus and the Jews. When a Hindu says to his teacher, "I'm God," the teacher says, "Congratulations, you passed the first test." When a Jew says to their teacher, "I'm God," the teacher would say, "That's blasphemy. Don't ever say that again." So if Jesus was a guru, as some people would claim, then he might have been the worst teacher in the history of man because nobody understood his teaching